can wing it if I have to, but let's not go there. So what do we do when we feel like God is absent? As of yesterday, nearly 6.5 million people worldwide have died of COVID-19 since the beginning of the pandemic 2.5 years ago. Each one of those we have lost has left a mark on those of us who remain. Death and disease continually surround us in these days. And in the words of author Marissa Renee Lee in her book, Grief is Love, we can no longer afford to ignore grief. We cannot afford to relegate it to whispered conversations, to expect folks to navigate their brokenheartedness on their own. It is neither practical, nor possible, nor humane. But at the same time, the pandemic has robbed us of many of the ways that we come together to do the work of grieving. Funerals were postponed, held over Zoom, or simply not held at all. Support networks were strained as many of us took on additional duties at home, suddenly becoming teachers where we had no training, or caregivers when we were used to having assistants. Others were left socially isolated, without the gatherings that normally kept them physically and mentally active. We have not been able to say goodbye properly to those that we love. Even within this church community, there have been those who have died that we have not been able to properly mourn. We said goodbye to Reverend Bonnie behind masks and welcomed a new pastor without being able to hug her. I too am mourning the loss of a church community I loved when I moved to this place. There are different kinds of mourning and different kinds of ways that we handle it. But in these last few years, it has seemed like we are overwhelmed with the grief of being alienated from the ones that we love, on top of the unrelenting grief of bearing witness to conflict and war, death and unrest all around us. It's all too easy when we think about it too hard to believe that we are alone and that God does not care. But as our passage from Revelation shows us, neither of those things is true. So our author opens with the vision of a great multitude, so great that it cannot be counted, which is really impressive for those of you who have read Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy and remember how much of those books is given over to tallying the nation of Israel as it comes into being. And this numberless crowd cries before the throne of God, "Salvation belongs to our God and to the Lamb." But what does that mean? The Greek word that's translated here as salvation, soteria, means the total well-being of people. So God wills our total well-being, and we find it in the presence of God and of Christ. Now, remember that this was written in the 1st century CE, and it was written to churches that were under the oversight of the Roman Empire. Now, the politics of the time held that the people's well-being came from the empire, and more importantly, by the will of the emperor. So this passage, this vision that seems so abstract, is in fact very concretely political, because it directly contradicts the message that Rome was given. John is saying in so many words that Rome can't live up to its own hype. Salvation is not and cannot be an imperially guarded commodity, because that is directly contrary to the nature of salvation. And we see this borne out as John describes the great multitude. The multitude consists of those who have been downtrodden, afflicted, bereaved, hungry, thirsty, oppressed, and despised for being strangers in a strange land. They are from every nation, tribe, tongue, race, gender, and class. No one group is outcast or excluded. And this is especially important as we try to understand what salvation really is. Because according to Revelation, final salvation does not pertain just to the soul and spiritual realities. Salvation is not just about pie in the sky when you die. Rather, it means the abolishment of all dehumanization and suffering, as well as restoration to the fullness of human well-being. And this vision of well-being and of salvation is the answer to the outcry of those who are seeking justice for the destruction of their lives. Remember, these people from every place and every time and every tongue are all there because they have been martyred for their faith. But they are all there together. Salvation is not just an individual action, because in order to meet the standards of God's holy justice, it has to be true for the whole community, for the most hurt, the most traumatized among us, if it is to be true salvation, true, total well-being for all. But there's another reason that God shows the great multitude to John. So as the elder beside him explains to him, God is both recognizing the suffering and loss that the multitude have undergone. He is also providing assurance to John and his audience that suffering and loss are not the end of their story. As one of my childhood pastors puts it, the worst thing is never the last thing. The worst thing is never the last thing. It reminds us who grieve, those who suffer, that we are not alone in our pain unless we choose to be. So what do we do when it feels like God is absent? We turn to the community that God has given us, to people who have also lost ones who were so precious to them that they will never fully heal this side of heaven. We turn to the ones who also carry the burden of families being torn apart. We turn to the ones who are also learning to cope with traumatic events in their past. We look to our elders in the faith, to the examples of the saints who have gone before, and to those random blessed folk who show up in our lives with just the right word at just the right time. Those blessed angels among us. And we also look to John's example. It would have been easy for John, as he looks at this vision, to push through to Moses or to Jesus or to somebody who can tell him what the heck is going on here. But instead, he turns and accepts the opening of the man sitting right next to him. Friends, sometimes we don't have to shout at the sky for answers. We can simply turn to the guides God has already provided in our midst. Take a look around. I'm serious, take a look around. Some of these faces you recognize, some of them you don't. But every single one has walked down a path of grief that might be unfamiliar to you, but is very familiar to them. And those of us who have been down those paths before, those paths of healing from trauma, from grief, and from suffering, we are called to accompany others in their pain. Now, hear me carefully when I say that accompanying others in their pain does not mean telling them how to grieve, right? Because everyone's grief is different. Every situation, every nuance means that what looks like good grieving to you may not look like good grieving to somebody else. But walking alongside those who grieve, not just leaving them to their own devices, is so key, because you are a witness to each one of those who are suffering that freedom is coming, that vindication is a promise, and that God will deliver. I've had several bouts of major depression in my life, and you'll hear about those, I'm sure, in a different sermon. But most of them have been triggered by the deaths of people I love. I shared about one of them in our email this week when I talked about my aunt who passed away in 2015. But during another one of those periods earlier in my life, I discovered something that has been a touchstone and a light for me, and I hope it will be the same for you. I want to invite you to grab your hymnals, those big red books, and turn to the back to number 883. And what you'll see there is a list of statements of faith, and the one I want you to look at is the Statement of Faith of the United Church of Canada. I love looking at statements of faith from around the world because they remind us both of how we practice differently, but also of what is truly the same across our community of belief all around the world. And I want to invite you as I close today to speak these words of hope along with me. We are not alone. We live in God's world. We believe in God who has created and is creating, who has come in Jesus, the Word made flesh, to reconcile and make new, who works in us and others by the Spirit. We trust in God. We are called to be the church, to celebrate God's presence, to love and serve others, to seek justice and to resist evil, to proclaim Jesus crucified and risen, our judge and our hope. In life, in death, in life beyond death, God is with us, and we are not alone. Thanks be to God. Amen.